Captain Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that sent shockwaves through diplomatic corridors from Washington to Brussels. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation bleeding from jihadist insurgency, officially restored full diplomatic relations with North Korea. Not China, not Russia, North Korea, one of the most isolated, sanctioned, and internationally condemned regimes on the planet. This wasn't a courtesy handshake. This was a calculated geopolitical detonation. And it raises a question that makes Western policymakers deeply uncomfortable. What happens when African nations stop asking permission to choose their own allies? To understand why this matters, you need to grasp what Burkina Faso has been living through. Since 2015, the country has been consumed by violence. Jihadist groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have turned vast regions into no-go zones. Schools burn. Villages empty overnight. Over 2 million people have been displaced. Thousands have been killed. The military has been outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overstretched. France, the former colonial power, had troops on the ground for years under Operation Barkhane. They promised security. They promised partnership. But the violence didn't stop. It intensified. And across the Sahel, a generation of young officers began asking a dangerous question. If the West can't deliver stability, why are we still listening to them? Ibrahim Traoré is the embodiment of that question. He's 36 years old, a military captain. He seized power in September 2022, not through a bloody purge, but through a coup that enjoyed popular support. His predecessor, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, had himself taken power in a coup just months earlier, also promising to restore security. Damiba failed. Traoré didn't waste time with pleasantries. Within weeks of taking control, he expelled French troops. He told them to leave. Not gradually, not diplomatically, just leave. Then he turned to Russia. Wagner Group mercenaries began appearing in the country. Russian military instructors followed. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would no longer accept partnerships defined by Paris or Washington. It would define them itself. But Russia and Wagner weren't enough. They brought muscle, but they came with their own agenda. Traoré needed options. He needed leverage. He needed partners who wouldn't lecture him about human rights while his citizens were being slaughtered. Enter North Korea. For decades, Pyongyang has been cut off from the global economy, strangled by sanctions, and treated as a pariah. But North Korea has something most sanctioned states don't: a sprawling military-industrial complex built on self-reliance. They manufacture weapons. They train soldiers. They export both quietly to nations willing to defy international pressure. And they do it cheaply. This isn't Burkina Faso's first dance with North Korea. The two countries had relations during the Cold War, a time when Pyongyang actively courted African nations under the banner of anti-imperialism and socialist solidarity. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader in the 1980s, was inspired by movements that rejected Western dominance. He was assassinated in 1987, and the political winds shifted. Ties with North Korea faded, but they were never formally severed. They were dormant. And now, under Traoré, they've been revived. Not as nostalgia, as strategy. What does Burkina Faso get from this partnership? Weapons. Small arms, ammunition, possibly rocket-propelled grenades, anti-aircraft systems. North Korean arms are basic, but they're functional. And they're available without the strings attached to Western defense contracts. No clauses about democratic governance. No requirements for transparency. No audits. Just a transaction. Beyond hardware, there's training. North Korean military advisors have a reputation for being disciplined and effective, forged in a system that prioritizes ideological commitment and operational endurance. For a military struggling to contain insurgents across a territory the size of Colorado, that matters. But this isn't just about bullets and training manuals. It's about testing. North Korea's military technology rarely sees real combat. Their weapons are designed, produced, and stockpiled, but seldom used in active theaters. Burkina Faso's insurgency offers something invaluable: a live laboratory. North Korean arms can be tested against guerrilla fighters in harsh terrain. Feedback loops can inform future designs. This is why Pyongyang has historically sent advisors to conflict zones in Africa and the Middle East. It's not charity, it's data collection. And then there's the political dividend. Every nation that recognizes North Korea, every handshake, every diplomatic communique, chips away at the narrative of total isolation. Pyongyang has spent decades being told it doesn't belong in the international community. But here's Burkina Faso, a sovereign African nation, saying the opposite. That recognition matters. It creates cracks in the sanctions architecture. It offers Pyongyang a foothold in a region where Western influence is visibly fraying. Africa is home to 54 nations, 54 votes in the United Nations. If even a handful begin to see North Korea not as a pariah, but as a viable partner, the geopolitical math starts to shift. For Traore, the symbolism is just as important as the substance. Aligning with North Korea sends a message that resonates far beyond Ouagadougou. It says, we will not be bullied into compliance. It says, sovereignty means the right to choose, even if those choices make you uncomfortable. It says, your sanctions, your condemnations, your lectures about the rules-based international order, they don't apply here anymore. This is a middle finger to the post-Cold War consensus that assumed Africa would remain locked in a Western sphere of influence, forever dependent, forever subordinate. But let's be clear about what this partnership actually represents. It's not ideological solidarity in the way Cold War alliances were. Traore isn't a communist. Burkina Faso isn't adopting Jewish philosophy. This is transactional. Pyongyang needs revenue to sustain its economy under crushing sanctions. Arms sales, even modest ones, generate hard currency. They keep the regime afloat. Burkina Faso needs security capacity, fast, without the baggage of Western oversight. Both parties are operating from positions of desperation and defiance. That's what makes the partnership viable. Desperation is a powerful negotiator. It's also risky. Burkina Faso is not a wealthy nation. It's one of the poorest countries on earth. Gross domestic product per capita hovers around $700. The government is cash-strapped, reliant on limited gold exports and international aid. Doing business with North Korea invites immediate scrutiny. The United Nations has imposed some of the strictest sanctions ever levied on a nation. Security Council resolutions prohibit arms sales, restrict financial transactions, and target entities that facilitate trade with Pyongyang. Any nation engaging with North Korea risks secondary sanctions, the kind that can freeze access to international banking systems and cripple trade. Western nations have already begun responding. France, predictably, condemned the move. So did the United States. The European Union expressed concern. The language is always similar, destabilizing, irresponsible, contrary to international norms. But here's what makes this moment different from past diplomatic rifts. Traore isn't backing down. He isn't issuing clarifications or walking back the decision. He's doubling down. In speeches, he's framed sovereignty not as abstract principle, but as lived reality. He's argued that for decades, African nations were told they had independence, but every meaningful decision, from currency to defense partnerships, required approval from Paris or Washington. That's not sovereignty. That's ventriloquism. This rhetoric resonates. Across the Sahel, a belt of countries stretching from Senegal to Sudan, populations are young, frustrated, and increasingly skeptical of the narratives they inherited. French is still the official language in many of these nations, but the psychological break from France is accelerating. In Mali, another military junta has expelled French forces and embraced Russian support. In Niger, a coup in July 2023 overthrew a pro-Western president, and the new leadership has similarly pivoted toward Moscow. Chad, long seen as France's most reliable partner in the region, has asked French troops to leave. The pattern is undeniable. The Sahel is an open revolt against the post-colonial order. Burkina Faso's alignment with North Korea fits within this broader wave, but it also exceeds it. Russia is a great power with historical ties to Africa and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Partnering with Moscow, while controversial, still falls within the bounds of realpolitik. But North Korea? North Korea is beyond the pale. It's the ultimate outsider. And that's precisely why the move is so potent. It's not just a rejection of Western dominance. It's a rejection of the entire framework that defines what is acceptable in international relations. Traore is saying, you don't get to decide who we talk to. You don't get to set the boundaries of legitimacy. We do. Now, does this mean Burkina Faso is about to become a client state of Pyongyang? Almost certainly not. North Korea lacks the resources to project power across Africa. Its economy is tiny, its diplomatic reach is limited, and its ability to sustain long-term commitments is questionable. This partnership is unlikely to be transformational in material terms. But that's not the point. The point is the precedent. If Burkina Faso can revive ties with North Korea without collapsing under sanctions, other nations might ask, what else can we get away with? What other rules can we bend or break? This is where the stakes become clear. The global order since 1945 has been built on a system of rules, norms, and institutions largely designed and enforced by the United States and its allies. That system has delivered unprecedented economic growth and relative stability for much of the world. But it's also been deeply unequal. The rules were written by the powerful, for the powerful. Enforcement has been selective. When Western nations invade countries or arm insurgents, it's called foreign policy. When others do the same, it's called aggression. That double standard has been tolerated for decades because there weren't alternatives. But now there are. China offers infrastructure without political conditions. Russia offers security without sermons. And North Korea, improbably, offers arms without judgment. The revival of Burkina Faso's ties with North Korea is a symptom of a larger fracture. It's part of a broader realignment in which nations that were once passive recipients of great power decisions are now asserting agency. They're testing boundaries. They're exploring options. They're asking, what happens if we just say no? And the answer increasingly is not much. Western powers issue statements. They threaten sanctions. They express disappointment. But they don't have the leverage they once did. They can't shut down these partnerships without destabilizing regions they still have interests in. They can't isolate rogue actors without pushing them further into the arms of rivals. Consider the economic dimension. Burkina Faso's gold sector is small but significant. It produces roughly 60 tons annually, worth about $3 billion at current prices. That gold is largely exported to Switzerland, the UAE, and other international markets. If the West imposes sanctions targeting Burkina Faso's economy, those exports could be disrupted. But here's the complication. China is the world's largest gold consumer. Russia has sophisticated sanctions evasion networks. If Western markets close, alternatives exist. They're less efficient, more expensive, but they exist. The era when economic isolation meant total collapse is over. There's also the insurgency itself. Western policymakers often frame jihadist violence in the Sahel as a security problem that requires military solutions and governance reforms. But for Traore, the calculus is more immediate. He needs to show results. His legitimacy rests on delivering security. If North Korean weapons help his forces push back militants, even marginally, that's a political win. If those weapons don't come with demands for electoral reforms or human rights audits, even better. The insurgents don't care about democratic norms. They care about territory, resources, and survival. Traore is matching their pragmatism. But let's not romanticize this. Aligning with North Korea comes with serious risks. Pyongyang's human rights record is among the worst on the planet. The regime runs a network of political prison camps where hundreds of thousands have died. It maintains one of the most repressive information environments in the world. It has threatened nuclear war. Associating with such a government invites moral and reputational costs. International human rights organizations will condemn Burkina Faso. Civil society groups will protest. And internally, there are questions. Traore came to power promising to restore security and sovereignty. But if that sovereignty is exercised by embracing one of the world's most brutal regimes, what does that say about the values underpinning his leadership? There's also the question of reliability. North Korea is not known for honoring long-term commitments, especially when external pressure mounts. If sanctions bite harder, if China or Russia pressure Pyongyang to scale back African engagements, Burkina Faso could find itself holding agreements that evaporate overnight. Unlike Russia, which has strategic depth and diversified partnerships, North Korea operates from a position of chronic weakness. It's a partner born of necessity, not strength. And then there's the regional dimension. Burkina Faso doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of the economic community of West African states, a bloc that has historically tried to enforce stability through collective action. ECOWAS has imposed sanctions on Mali and Niger following their coups. It threatened military intervention. Those threats didn't materialize, in part because member states were divided and lacked the capacity. But Burkina Faso's move toward North Korea adds another layer of complexity. If ECOWAS condemns the partnership, it risks deepening the fracture within the bloc. If it stays silent, it signals impotence. Either way, regional cohesion suffers. Nigeria, the region's most populous and economically powerful nation, faces a dilemma. It has maintained relatively stable relations with the West, while also expanding ties with China and Russia. Nigerian policymakers are pragmatic. They understand the appeal of diversifying partnerships. But North Korea is a step beyond pragmatism. It's provocation. If Abuja endorses or even tolerates Burkina Faso's decision, it risks damaging its own relations with Washington and European capitals. If it condemns the move, it risks alienating a neighbor and feeding the narrative that ECOWAS is a tool of Western interests. There's no clean option. Senegal, under its relatively pro-Western leadership, has tried to position itself as a stable, democratic alternative to the chaos further inland. But Senegal also understands the currents moving through the region. Anti-French sentiment is real. Demands for sovereignty are genuine. If Dakar appears too aligned with Western positions, it risks domestic backlash. The youth bulge across West Africa is massive. Median age in Burkina Faso is around 17. These are populations that didn't live through the Cold War. They don't remember the ideological battles between capitalism and communism. What they see is unemployment, insecurity, and political elites who seem more accountable to foreign capitals than to their own citizens. In that context, Traoré's defiance looks like courage. This is where the story becomes less about Burkina Faso specifically and more about what it represents. For decades, Africa has been described in terms of its problems: poverty, conflict, corruption, disease. That framing has justified endless interventions, aid programs, and paternalistic policies. But what's happening now is different. African nations are asserting themselves not as victims or recipients, but as actors. They're making choices that reflect their interests, even when those choices conflict with Western preferences. That's uncomfortable. It's messy. It doesn't fit neatly into the narratives of progress and partnership that have dominated development discourse. Traoré's decision to align with North Korea won't be remembered because of the number of weapons delivered or the quality of training provided. It will be remembered because of what it signals. It signals that the rules are changing. It signals that the monopoly on legitimacy that Western institutions have enjoyed is eroding. It signals that desperation, when combined with defiance, can produce alliances that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. And it signals that the future of African geopolitics will be shaped not by adherence to a global order designed in 1945, but by the messy, transactional, often brutal logic of survival. There's a broader question here about what sovereignty actually means in the 21st century. Is it the ability to hold elections and maintain democratic institutions? Or is it the ability to make decisions without external approval, even when those decisions are morally questionable? Traoré would argue it's the latter. Sovereignty, in his view, is not a gift bestowed by the international community. It's an inherent right exercised through action. And if that action includes partnering with North Korea, so be it. The alternative, from his perspective, is continued dependence on partners who have failed to deliver security, development, or dignity. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This kind of sovereignty, unmoored from any collective framework, leads to fragmentation. It leads to a world where might makes right, where norms dissolve, and where the strong prey on the weak without consequence. The post-1945 order, for all its flaws, created space for smaller nations to have a voice. It established principles, however imperfectly enforced, that constrained the most destructive impulses of great powers. If that order collapses completely, it's not clear what replaces it. A multipolar world sounds appealing in theory. In practice, it often means a return to spheres of influence, proxy wars, and zero-sum competition. Burkina Faso's partnership with North Korea might inspire other nations to pursue similarly bold, defiant alliances. Or it might serve as a cautionary tale. The outcome depends on variables that are difficult to predict. Will the North Korean weapons actually help turn the tide against the insurgents? Will the partnership generate enough economic or political value to offset the reputational costs? Will Western nations find ways to impose meaningful consequences? Or will they prove as toothless as they have been in Mali and Niger? And most importantly, will the Burkinabe people, the ones living through the violence and instability, see this as a step toward security, or as a desperate gamble by a leader with few options? What's certain is that this story doesn't end with the restoration of diplomatic ties. It's only beginning. Watch what happens next in the Sahel. Watch how Russia responds, because Moscow won't appreciate competition from Pyongyang in a region it's tried to dominate. Watch how China reacts, because Beijing has its own interests in Africa and won't want instability that disrupts its Belt and Road projects. Watch how the United States and Europe recalibrate their strategies, because the old playbook, the one built on aid and conditionality and military partnerships, clearly isn't working. And watch the other African nations, the ones facing similar security crises, the ones frustrated with traditional partners, the ones wondering if they, too, can break the rules without breaking their states. Because Burkina Faso just showed them that it's possible. It might not be wise, it might not be sustainable, but it's possible. And in a world where the old certainties are collapsing, possibility is a powerful thing. This is not a story about good guys and bad guys. Traore is not a hero. North Korea is not a liberator. The West is not simply an oppressor. This is a story about power, pressure, and the choices nations make when they feel trapped. It's a story about what happens when the center cannot hold, when the institutions that once commanded respect lose their authority, and when desperation becomes the mother of unlikely alliances. Burkina Faso's gambit with North Korea is a fracture line in the international order. Whether it becomes a full break depends on what happens in the coming months and years. What happens next could redefine not just the Sahel, but the entire architecture of global politics. Because if a landlocked, impoverished, conflict-ridden nation can successfully defy the world's most powerful countries and align with its most isolated pariah state, then the question isn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. The question is, who's next?